Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a period that's more than just dates and battles. It's about how a war actually set the stage for
Yeah.
Canada as we know it today, the Seven Years' War.
And get this, our sources. Not just, dry history books. We've got textbook excerpts, lesson summaries, even a case study about how a lacrosse game actually changed a battle.
A lacrosse game. Okay, now you've got my attention. But before we jump into the action, let's zoom out a bit. I always find it helpful to get the bigger picture first. So what was going on in the world back then that led to this war?
Well, it boils down to, a classic power struggle. England and France, they were like the superpowers of the day, constantly battling it out for territories and resources.
Makes sense. But this wasn't just some European squabble, right? This fight spilled over into North America, too.
Right. It wasn't just in Europe. They were also vying for control over here in North America, specifically the Ohio River Valley, major hub for the fur trade, you see, and strategic spots like Louisbourg and Quebec.
So whoever controlled those spots basically controlled the flow of goods, the power in the region, high stakes. But it wasn't just England and France duking it out, right? There were other players on the field, too.
Absolutely. You've got the French Canadians, the Acadians, First Nations. They all had their own perspectives and anxieties about this looming war. Take the Canadians, for example. They felt pretty secure under French rule.
And the Acadians, what about them?
Oh, the Acadians, they just wanted to stay neutral. Imagine being caught between two warring empires. Not an easy position to be in at all.
No, I can imagine. It's easy to forget that wars aren't just about, armies clashing. They have a ripple effect impacting everyone. Speaking of which, our sources mentioned this great upheaval. What is that all about?
So in 1755, the British, they got suspicious of the Acadians' neutrality, demanded they pledge their loyalty to the crown.
And I'm guessing the Acadians weren't too keen on that.
Well, when they refused, they were forcibly removed from their homes in Nova Scotia. Imagine the devastation. Families torn apart, homes destroyed, livelihoods completely shattered. It's a stark reminder of how war can just completely upend the lives of innocent people.
Tragic. But amidst all this turmoil, there were also moments of incredible ingenuity, especially from the First Nations. They were often outnumbered and outgunned, yet they managed to outsmart their opponents.
Yeah. What's fascinating is how they use their knowledge of the land, and their understanding of their enemy's mindset to actually secure victories against a much larger and better equipped force. For example, the capture of Fort Michilimackinac.
Wait, is this where the lacrosse game comes in?
You bet. The Ojibwa, allied with the French, they staged a lacrosse match right outside the fort, drew the British soldiers out to watch, and using the game as a distraction, they stormed the fort, took it in minutes.
Wow. Talk about a strategic play, using the British's curiosity against them. Incredible. So we've got this backdrop of global conflict, diverse perspectives, the forced displacement of the Acadians. What were some of those key military turning points that ultimately shaped Canada's destiny?
Well, the first major blow to the French was the fall of Louisbourg in 1758. Now, this fortress, it guarded the entrance to the St. Lawrence River, the gateway to the heart of New France.
The sources describe a brutal 7-week siege.
Yeah.
The British just bombarded the fortress relentlessly.
Yeah. Facing overwhelming odds, dwindling supplies, the French eventually surrendered.
Huge morale blow, I'd imagine. So what happened next?
This victory handed the British control of the St. Lawrence, paved the way for their advance on Quebec City, which brings us to what many consider the most crucial battle in Canadian history, the Battle on the Plains of Abraham.
The Plains of Abraham. The name itself sounds almost mythical.
And the events live up to the name. 1759, British General James Wolfe led a daring nighttime climb to the Plains of Abraham, a plateau overlooking Quebec City, caught the French, led by the Marquis de Montcalm, completely by surprise, and a fierce battle ensued.
Was this a long, drawn-out battle?
Believe it or not, the whole engagement lasted a mere 15 minutes.
15 minutes?
Yep, but a bloody 15 minutes. Resulted in over 1,300 casualties, including both Wolfe and Montcalm. It was a decisive victory for the British, a pivotal turning point that ultimately led to the downfall of New France.
It's hard to grasp how a mere 15 minutes could so profoundly alter the course of history.
Yeah. It really underscores the strategic importance of Quebec City and the ferocity of the fight for control of Canada. But even after the fall of Quebec, the story wasn't over, was it?
I have a feeling it wasn't. Didn't the First Nations continue to resist British rule even after the French surrendered?
You're absolutely right. That brings us to Pontiac's War, a significant chapter in the ongoing struggle for Indigenous rights and autonomy.
Tell me more about Pontiac and his role in this conflict.
Well, Pontiac was an Odawa leader. He understood that British rule would drastically change things, the existing dynamics. So he rallied various First Nations to drive the British out of the Ohio River Valley. He knew the British weren't like the French. They weren't interested in preserving those traditional trade relationships or respecting indigenous sovereignty.
So Pontiac saw the writing on the wall and took action to protect his people's way of life.
Yeah.
What was the outcome of all this resistance?
While Pontiac's War didn't achieve its primary objective of expelling the British, it definitely served as a powerful message. It forced the British to acknowledge that they couldn't simply disregard the First Nations' concerns and expect peace. This realization heavily influenced British policies in the years to come.
So even in defeat, Pontiac's resistance left a lasting mark. Now, we know that the Seven Years' War officially ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, ceding New France to British control.
But here's the thing. The treaty completely overlooked the First Nations' concerns, setting the stage for future conflicts. Classic example of how ignoring the needs and rights of a group can lead to more problems down the road.
A great point. It seems like every action has a reaction, and those reactions ripple through history. So, the British are now in control of this vast territory. But how do you govern a population that has its own distinct culture, language, and legal system?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. They were faced with this critical question. Should they evict the Canadians, force them to assimilate, or find a way to accommodate their existing ways? This dilemma led to two very different approaches: the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Quebec Act of 1774.
Okay, this is where I need you to break it down for me. What were these two approaches and how do they differ?
All right, so the Royal Proclamation of 1763, it was all about assimilation. It aimed to impose British laws and institutions on Quebec, effectively attempting to erase French language and culture. It also restricted westward expansion, which really angered American colonists who saw the Ohio Valley as their rightful territory.
So the British were trying to create a mini England in North America. Did that go as planned? I'm guessing not, given the tensions you just mentioned.
Not even close. The Canadians resisted assimilation, and tensions in the 13 colonies escalated, eventually igniting the American Revolution. It became clear that their initial approach was backfiring spectacularly.
So what did the British do next? Did they double down on assimilation or did they try something different?
They realized they needed to secure the loyalty of Quebec, especially with all that unrest brewing down south. And this change of heart led to the Quebec Act of 1774, a dramatic departure from those assimilationist policies of the Royal Proclamation.
Okay, I'm all ears. What did this Quebec Act actually do?
It was a game changer. It officially recognized the French language, permitted its use in courts and government. It also restored French civil law for things like property and inheritance, and granted religious freedom to Catholics.
Wow, that's a complete 180 from their initial strategy. It's like they went from trying to erase French culture to embracing it. What prompted such a radical shift?
It was a move born out of necessity. They needed the support of the Canadians, and they recognized that forcing assimilation wasn't the way to get it.
So they chose pragmatism over ideology. Fascinating. What were the long-term implications of this decision?
Well, this pragmatic move had profound consequences for Canada's development. It laid the foundation for bilingualism and multiculturalism, principles that are at the very heart of Canadian identity today. Who would thought that a war fought between European powers would ultimately lead to the recognition and celebration of diversity in a new nation?
It's incredible how these events, sparked by conflict and political maneuvering, ended up contributing to a nation that values inclusivity. I'm sensing a theme here, that unexpected consequences can sometimes lead to positive outcomes. But we've only just scratched the surface of this story. There's so much more to uncover about the 7 Years' War and its lasting impact on Canada.
You're absolutely right. We've laid the groundwork, but there's still plenty to explore.
I'm ready to keep digging.
It's amazing how this one war just set off this chain reaction, leading to so many pivotal moments in Canadian history. And when you really think about it, it all goes back to that question we were talking about earlier, How do you govern a diverse population, one with all these different languages, cultures, legal systems?
Right. And we saw how the British, they went back and forth, first trying to impose their ways, then realizing, whoa, we need a different approach here. But it wasn't just about laws and languages, was it? It was about land, too, especially when it came to the First Nations.
Oh, absolutely. The 7 Years' War and those treaties that followed, totally reshaped the map of North America. And as we saw with Pontiac's War, the First Nations, they were determined to resist this encroachment on their lands and their way of life.
Which brings us to another fascinating document from this era, the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Can you refresh my memory on what this proclamation was all about?
Sure. It was issued by King George III, and it was meant to, establish British control over all those vast territories they'd won from France, including, of course, the land that would become Canada. But here's the key part. It also included this really important provision regarding First Nations land rights.
Okay, now this is where it gets interesting. What did the proclamation actually say about Indigenous lands?
Well, it actually recognized the First Nations' right to the lands they occupied. It said that European settlement couldn't happen without treaties negotiated with those nations. It was a landmark moment, a recognition of Indigenous sovereignty that would influence treaties and land claims for centuries to come.
That's a pretty big deal. So, even in the midst of all this conquest and empire building, there was an attempt to acknowledge Indigenous rights.
Yes. But of course, the reality on the ground, often very different. The history of Indigenous settler relations in Canada is full of, broken promises, forced assimilation, and those ongoing struggles for land rights and self-determination. The proclamation was more of a starting point, an ideal, one that was rarely fully realized.
It's like setting a precedent, but then not always following through.
Okay.
It's tragic, really, how these patterns of broken promises just repeat themselves throughout history.
It is, but the Royal Proclamation, it still stands as this powerful symbol. It continues to be cited in legal battles and political negotiations, even today.
So, in a way, it's a reminder that even during times of war and conquest, there were moments of recognition. Moments where those in power tried to establish a more, just relationship with Indigenous peoples. It's a shame that these efforts weren't always upheld.
Absolutely. And I think it also raises important questions about how we understand history. Our understanding of the past, it's constantly evolving. And it's crucial to be aware of the different perspectives and biases that shape those narratives.
That reminds me of something else the sources mentioned, the expulsion of the Acadians. The way that story is told can vary so much depending on whose perspective you're hearing.
It's a perfect example of how crucial it is to seek out diverse viewpoints when trying to piece together a more complete and accurate understanding of the past. We often hear the British side of the story. But what about the Acadians themselves?
Right. Their voices are so important.
Yeah.
And it's not just about getting the facts straight. It's about acknowledging the human cost of these historical events and recognizing the lasting impact they had on people's lives and identities.
Exactly. Think about the Acadians, forced from their homes, scattered across the Atlantic world. But they clung to their language, their traditions, their sense of community. It's a powerful story of resilience, the enduring power of culture, even in the face of incredible hardship.
And their story, it doesn't end there, right? Their legacy is still felt today, especially in Atlantic Canada, where Acadian culture thrives and contributes to that rich tapestry of Canadian society.
It's a reminder that the events of the past continue to shape the present. And understanding that history, well, it's key to building a more just and inclusive future.
As we're talking about this, I keep thinking about the concept of turning points. Those moments in history that seem to alter the course of events, leading to these profound and often unforeseen outcomes.
Turning points are fascinating. It's like those moments at a fork in the road, one decision, one battle, one seemingly small event can just send history down a completely different path.
And identifying those turning points helps us make sense of all the complexities of history. It lets us see how seemingly insignificant events can have these huge ripple effects that resonate for generations.
So let's talk about some of the turning points that really stand out from the 7 Years' War, and its impact on Canada. What comes to mind for you?
Well, the capture of Louisbourg in 1758 has to be up there. That victory, it gave the British control of the St. Lawrence River, basically opening the door to their eventual capture of Quebec City. It's like that domino effect, one event leads to the next, ultimately resulting in a massive power shift.
And then, of course, there's the Battle on the Plains of Abraham. Hard to imagine a more dramatic turning point. A 15-minute clash that determined the fate of New France.
A 15-minute battle changing the course of an entire nation is mind-blowing.
But even beyond those major battles, there are these smaller moments that might not seem that significant at the time, but they contribute to a much larger shift in the course of events.
What kind of smaller moments are you thinking of?
Think back to that La Crosse ruse at Fort Michilimackinac. It might seem like a small victory on the surface, But it really showcases the First Nations' strategic thinking and their, unwavering determination to resist British control.
It also highlights how important perspective is. What might seem like a minor event to one group can be a defining moment for another, shaping their identity and their relationship with that dominant power.
Exactly. History isn't just about the big, splashy events. It's about understanding those nuances, the different perspectives, the ripple effects of seemingly small actions.
It's like weaving a tapestry. All those threads, big and small, coming together to create the bigger picture. And as we dive deeper into these sources, we see the connections between those events, the impact of decisions made centuries ago, and how they shaped the Canada we know today.
It's a journey of discovery, and it pushes us to think critically about how we interpret the past and what lessons we can carry with us into the future.
As we've been exploring these sources and piecing together this story, I can't help but think about that age-old question. Does history repeat itself?
It's a question that's always on my mind, especially when we delve into these, pivotal periods. I think it's less about literal repetition and more about recognizing patterns, understanding the root causes of conflict, and learning from those choices made by, those who came before us.
So what kind of patterns emerge from what we've learned about the 7 Years' War?
Right.
Its aftermath.
Well, one recurring theme is that, that relentless struggle for power and control, whether it's between empires, between colonizers and indigenous peoples, or even between different cultural groups within a society. That desire for dominance it just shapes so much of human history. In the case of the 7 Years' War, it was all about these two European empires, battling for supremacy in North America.
And that struggle had a direct impact on everyone who lived here, particularly the Acadians and the First Nations. Their experiences, they really highlight the human cost of these power struggles and why it's so crucial to consider those who are often marginalized or silenced in the historical narratives.
Exactly. We can't just focus on the actions of the powerful. We have to understand how those actions, ripple outward, impacting the lives of everyday people. And another pattern we see, which we touched on earlier, is this tension between assimilation and accommodation.
Right. The British initially tried to assimilate the Canadians, forcing them to adopt British laws and customs. But that strategy, it backfired spectacularly.
Oh, it did. It fueled resistance, sparked unrest, ultimately contributed to the American Revolution. Then, the British, learning from their mistakes, they shifted to a more accommodating approach with the Quebec Act, recognizing French language rights, granting religious freedom.
It's amazing how a policy shift, born out of necessity, basically needing the support of the Canadians, actually laid the groundwork for a more inclusive and diverse Canada.
It's a prime example of how pragmatism can sometimes lead to unexpected but positive outcomes. And it reinforces that idea that recognizing and respecting difference, instead of trying to erase it, can actually create a more stable and harmonious society.
So maybe history doesn't repeat itself in a, literal, predictable way. But it does offer us these valuable lessons about human nature, the consequences of our choices, and the potential for positive change, even amidst conflict.
I couldn't agree more. Studying the past, it gives us insights into the present, helps us make more informed decisions about the future, and that's what makes history so relevant, so essential. It's not just about memorizing facts and dates. It's about understanding those forces that have shaped our world, the choices we face as individuals and as a society, and how we can create a more just and equitable future for everyone.
It's almost like history is this, conversation.
Yeah.
It's constantly evolving, and we're all invited to participate.
You put it perfectly. We need to keep asking questions, challenging assumptions, and seeking out those diverse perspectives to, truly understand the richness and complexity of the past.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, exploring the causes and consequences of the 7 Years' War, the diverse perspectives of those involved, and how those events continue to shape Canada today. It's been a fascinating journey.
And remember, we've only just scratched the surface. There are countless stories to uncover, personal accounts to explore, historical debates to engage with.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the 7 Years' War, we encourage you to keep digging, to challenge your own assumptions, and to reflect on how the events of the past continue to influence the Canada we live in today.
What resonates most strongly with you from what we've discussed today? How can those lessons guide us as we navigate the complexities of our own time and work towards a more peaceful and inclusive world?
Those are great questions to ponder. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.